3, 2, 1. Welcome to the David the Dog Trainer Podcast, episode 152. Today we are being joined by Dr. Melanie of Canine Decoded. She is a neuroscientist turned dog trainer. So let's get her on and see what we get.
Hey guys.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
All right. Give me 1 second here.
Recording in progress.
Beautiful. You would not believe how many podcasts we've done where we get like 25 minutes into the episode and realize we forgot to hit the record Zoom button.
Oh my God.
Where, luckily,
I can imagine.
we record all of our audio separately. So like we have like the podcast, but it's like we have to make something up for the first like 20 minutes of it for the YouTube video and stuff like that. And it's always a disaster. So this guy always nudges
Yeah,
me.
I noticed that you know, this function of just having automatically start the recording,
Yes.
certain platforms, they don't have that, but I would love to have it. So it just starts the recording automatically without you having to actually push it.
We've looked it up so many times for Zoom on if there's a way to just have it auto record, but like I just don't think they have it as an option, which is just ridiculous. So
Yeah.
if you're listening, Zoom, get it together for us.
True.
Awesome. Well, so nice to meet you. I'm David. This is Josh.
Hey Josh.
Hi.
We're really looking forward to this. So I got connected with you through a friend of mine who has a dog training business up in Canada who's been following your stuff. And over the last, I don't know, maybe a couple months or so, we've done a few episodes where we kind of, you know, we started talking about this concept of like emotions with dogs and how a lot of trainers view them, a lot of how the owners view them and stuff like that. And it's funny. I was listening to your podcast you did with the Canine Paradigm this morning, and they said the same thing I was going to say at the beginning, which is like us dog trainers sometimes are very good at just using bro science with stuff where we link together obviously a lot of concepts that it's like this logically I feel like makes sense, right? And like based on our observations and like anecdotal data we have on things, like it makes sense, but we don't actually know a lot of the nuances behind a lot of it. So I think it's really awesome that you're in this unique position, obviously, as a neuroscientist, where you're also working with dogs and you've been able to kind of correlate and link a lot of these different things together and kind of can explain things in a little bit more complex of a manner for us and stuff. So I think it'll make some really awesome conversation. And past that, like as I've been binging your content over the last couple of days, I just have like a gazillion different like directions I feel like we could go with this conversation. So I'm just really looking forward to it. So thanks.
Thanks for having me.
So why don't you go ahead and just kind of give us a little bit of a background on yourself? Obviously, I know you're, training dogs right now. I know you obviously have a PhD, I believe in, what is it, neurobiology or neuroscience?
It's natural sciences. The way it works in Germany is a little bit different. So you kind of pick a topic. So I was doing my PhD at the Institute for Tropical Medicine.
Okay.
And you kind of get then into all kinds of field because they make you do that. And then after I graduated, and it says natural sciences on my diploma or whatever, at Columbia University, it's where it became more movement into neuroscience itself because I was working with the gut-brain axis.
Got it.
And then I made the jump off of the academic world.
Very cool. Yeah, so I'm just really interested to hear how kind of the progression of you taking that knowledge and applying it to dog training kind of came about.
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't plan for it. I really didn't. It wasn't really that I was like, "Ooh, this is missing in the dog training world." Because when I started pivoting away from academia and then kind of wondering what I'm going to do with my life, I did have the experience when I volunteered in Thailand where there was a tuberculosis lab, so nothing to do with dogs, but there were a lot of stray dogs hanging out.
Sure.
There was this weird combination of, hey, I'm coming to this lab and I want to help you guys optimize your lab processes so you can help more migrants not die from tuberculosis. And what I thought I'm coming for was definitely not what they had me do or what they actually needed. So that's where it dawned on me that, what's happening behind these big lab walls at these Ivy League schools. What's happening in the field, like vastly different, and such a huge disconnect, not just in dog training, or in canine science, but really probably in a lot of different fields. And at the same time, it's like, when I started studying biology, it's like I love animals, and I always had a cat, and like the whole stuff. And then there were these street dogs, and like, let's see what they do. And they came after me, and I was like running away from them on my bike. It's like, damn it, I don't know anything about these dogs here living on the street in Thailand. What am I going to do with this? And there was this urge of like, that sucks. I hate that feeling of I'm studying all that thing for like 12 years. And then, hands-on wise, I have no idea. And then I got more hands-on at my own dog and blah. And then I got kind of bombarded with this clash and all these questions about how to train a dog. What's the best way of training a dog? And I had these questions for my own dog if I wanted to take it to the next level in terms of training. And then I had to answer these questions myself because I felt like I got lost. I fell down this rabbit hole of online dog training, social media stuff.
Yeah.
I was like, well, let me see if I can answer these questions myself.
Sure.
And that's what you said at the beginning. That's how it really came together. It's like puzzling together what I know in terms of theory and neuroscience and just the animal behavior and what do you do and what I see in front of me and what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And then I started talking more about this and, 5 years, 6 years later, now we're here.
Yeah, that's awesome. So do you do a lot of like hands-on work with clients and stuff?
I still do. I did it the first 4 years when I really started getting into dog training.
Sure.
And I was on the board of a rescue organization here in Atlanta. And so I created rehab programs and went in and helped these dogs to at least the beginning of rehab, evaluating dogs that came in. And then also doing lots of in-person stuff. And then the pandemic hit. Mm-hmm. And I kind of pivoted a little bit and put more educational stuff together, which is now mostly online. So I have this mix of my online programs, but also going for in-person seminars. So that's happening more so. And then here and there, if I have time and if I have open spots, I do some in person too.
Yeah, very cool. The rescue rehab world, like working in that is a really, really interesting space because obviously you're dealing with these animals in such a complex and counterproductive environment. You know what I mean? I'd like to hear a little bit about how you kind of worked through some of that and, how you kind of came up with plans to help these dogs like while they were still in the shelters and then how you kind of saw that transition as they were getting homed.
It's messy work and it's not as fulfilling as a lot of people make it sound like, that you see these beautiful transformations, because oftentimes you honestly don't see these beautiful transformations. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And after they get adopted, I oftentimes also lost touch with how they're really doing. Yeah. I think my biggest work came into making the staff that works day to day with these dogs and potential adopters aware that what you see is not necessarily what you get. Yeah. Mostly in the context of you see this really skittish, anxious, aggressive dog. It doesn't mean it is a skittish, anxious, aggressive dog. You just got to put some work into helping. But it could also be the other way around. You see this really shy, cute dog, give this dog a little bit more confidence and too much freedom, and it might actually become a little more of a pushy dog and problematic dog. So what I did was less of like this classic obedience training with these dogs and really just get them out of their shell, see what they're motivated by, what kind of behaviors is sporadic or stress-driven, what's the true personality, and then kind of help the staff understand it themselves and see it themselves and then communicate it to the adopters and help also understand these are good adopters or these are suitable homes and these are not suitable homes. Mm. And there is some sort of, breed bias, especially here in the South. Yep. There was basically all pit mixes, here and there, Shepherd or Belgian Malinois even, powerful dogs, right? Mm. And then you come in with like two little kids, and a family because they want to do a good thing. And like saying no to something like that seems so not right, because you want to give this dog a new home.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you gotta look like big picture here, right? Where's this dog going to end up if you don't know how this dog is going to behave in certain environments? So this kind of stuff was happening basically.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, we have a couple of different shelters that we work pretty regularly with here that all send dogs to training with us, or we'll do, in-person stuff where we go to the shelter and, assess some of the dogs they have and stuff. And the ones that I've noticed that have made the biggest impacts of things have been the ones that have had some sort of kind of on-staff training or, behavior specialist or something like that could spend some time not doing just obedience training and stuff with the dogs, because that's a big point I had on here is your opinions on the difference between training from the, original sense of like obedience commands and sit down, stay and all of those types of things, and then behavior, which I view those two things as very, very different, obviously. But sometimes I feel like they get meshed into one where you get problem behavior cases and it's like, well, just put them through an obedience program, right? And make them more obedient and stuff, where it's just, it's much, much deeper than that. In a lot of cases, I feel like you can get a very obedient but still extremely dangerous or anxious or aggressive dog, but they put a lot of emphasis into just understanding the individual dogs, and if they're seeing problem behaviors, why they might be exhibiting those things, and how a lot of the things that the volunteers or the workers at the shelter might be doing to contribute to the problem, because they don't understand what they're doing and the messages they're sending to the dogs and all of those types of things, So that's really cool. So yeah, I mean, as far as the the differences between training and behavior, like how do you view those two things as different in your work?
So everything you do with your dog is teaching your dog something. The dog is learning, and we think that training is kind of this encapsulated moment where we teach our dogs how to behave a certain way. But behavior is what they learn every single day. So I don't like this differentiation, because it's behavior that the dog learns. Either that's the behavior you want or you don't want, but the dog is learning something, right? Sure. All the time. And, obedience, yes, you have like a certain process that you go through, versus all these 23 hours of the day where you don't actively or not consciously interact with your dog. Sure. And that's the behavior that you see, and then that's the behavior you get that you want or don't want. And then you start the formal obedience to stop the first behavior that the dog learned along the way. So I think just the understanding of what it means to train a dog, that it doesn't mean, to have 5,000 different obedience commands, which is fun. You should do that regardless, right? I mean, the dog wants to have this kind of mental stimulation, but the actual behavior that most people want in their pet dogs, polite greeting, not pulling on the leash, all these things, you don't necessarily need formal obedience training, at least not in the first phase of learning. Yep. You just need to have certain way of being consistent, make it a win-win situation for the dog, manage what you don't want, show what you want, and you don't really need any formal obedience for that. And that's just how dogs learn, right? So learning is really putting life into context, and a dog is doing this all day long, whether you want it or not. So for me, again, behavior is what I'm more interested in, but it's still training, because even if I don't train, it's still kind of doing something, right?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying completely. Yeah, I suppose then, like obedience and behavior might be the two differentiations that I would make with that. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think, with the obedience stuff, I see, with a lot of trainers and stuff, that they use obedience a lot to try to solve these problems without realizing it's almost managing it, is the way that I view it. Like you said, you're using an obedience command to stop a dog from rehearsing A, B, C, or D thing without addressing, why that dog might be doing that in the first place. So when you don't use the obedience to manage it, they go right back to rehearsing that behavior, is kind of the way I've always viewed it,
Yeah, I agree. It depends, obviously, of what exactly, obedience can be very, very powerful. Sure. And I love that dogs can learn all these different things and can really, keep you on your toes too. What you do with that is probably the better question to ask, because for pet dogs in particular, if you think about what kind of obedience we want, it's usually to stop the behavior we don't want,
Yes.
right? Leave it, drop it, come, place, stay, wait, sit. We don't teach any of these commands because we think the dog is having fun doing it. We do this because we don't want our dogs to do this and this and that. So it's always about stopping something, suppressing something, right? What about the obedience that you can teach to make your dog want the new behavior do even more, right? So the look command is something that, I have a hate-love relationship with, because most of the time it's like, look at me, but like freeze in the moment. I know there are all these dogs that you kind of want to bite their face off in this moment, but look at me. And for the dog, it's like, why? Why in this world would I do that, right? But what do you do with this if the dog actually does glance at you or actually learn to look at you for a second? Well, then the big thing happens with the teamwork, right? Then if you want to call it reward happens, not just the kibble that you throw, but like the dog actually looked at you to gain something else, which might be something that is competing with the original behavior that you wanted to stop. And that is where the obedience can direct, right? But this is where obedience can steer the dog in the better direction. But the true work comes, what do you do then when the dog actually behaves? Not just the classic, here's a piece of food kind of reward, but everything else that the dog actually likes doing, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, the look is a tough one with, I would say like a love-hate relationship with it, because it's still an obedience command, right? That we're using in order to try to get the dog to stop doing something else, right? But I feel like the reason why I don't like it in certain cases, and this is where I'm interested to hear your opinion, is with a lot of things that we're trying to stop our dog from doing, like let's take dog reactivity, for example, because I think that's a common place people will use the look command. Don't we want to some extent the dog to like look at and investigate the trigger that it is that they're concerned by in that moment? And let's say you wanted the dog to not lunge or not react or whatever it may be. Like we could obviously, address that specific issue, whatever way we want to go about doing it. Obviously, there's plenty of ways to get to that result, obviously. But to say like you're really concerned about this specific trigger, don't look at it, look at me instead. I feel like that's the place I see a lot of people take that command, which I don't feel is a realistic expectation in the moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's absolutely not. And I think this is where most owners kind of skip a step. Because certainly there is a time where you can say, look, and the dog looks. But
sure.
I think at that point that the dog would probably look automatically anyways, because you have done all the work beforehand. So you might not even need that word anymore.
Yeah, you're
But
relevant.
before that, it's like your dog, again, has no motivation to look at you. So you got to help your dog not look at the other dog in the reactivity case, right? You use all these other tools that are not obedience to help your dog. Use movement, use the leash, whatever you have, right? And the look, what does look mean? Look means look at the owner, look at me, right? You need that focus for sure, especially in the very, very first phase of rehab when it comes to reactivity. So the dog has a focus point, which is you, right? So you can prevent behaviors you don't want just by the dog focusing on you. And then maybe there are triggers in the background, right? But it fades out. Give your dog a chance to, give your dog the permission to fade out everything else.
Yeah.
By motivating your dog to focus on you. You don't need obedience with that. You can layer it in. And if it works, great, right? Probably at the beginning it doesn't. Because most dogs also have never learned to focus on the walker, the handler outside. Because how we walk is do whatever you want until a problem happens.
Yeah.
And then you kind of start the training.
Do you look at your look similar to, I've seen in a lot of your posts, excuse me, you reference engagement a lot, obviously, and engagement being a prerequisite for other things. And I know I saw, you did a podcast with Michael Ellis, and Michael Ellis was a very, he was probably my early inspiration in dog training when I first started getting into things. And obviously he teaches his prerequisite before doing anything else is going through engagement sessions with the dog, right? And as you teach engagement as an independent skill, once you have that engagement, the learning can then start, right? So is that kind of the way you view, using look in a way of achieving engagement? And it's not so much that the dog is looking at you and making eye contact, but you have, you're a relevant person in the equation that the dog wants to look to for guidance. Is that kind of how you view it? Or?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So I don't personally don't even use look.
Sure.
Because again, for me, it's not about just sit in front of me, look at me. For me, it's just focus on me. So I have my other hey, or whatever cues I have. And it is really important to implement that before it matters, because whether you cue it in or not, the engagement has to be something that triggers a certain emotional state, meaning some activation, right? You cannot expect a dog to stay calm if the dog wants to react.
Yeah.
But also you don't want your dog, even if your dog could stay calm, you kind of don't want your dog to stay calm. You want to have a certain activation and you want to have the engagement with you. And these two things together make your dog a learning machine. And then you can teach everything you want, really, including ignore the triggers, because then the dog kind of eventually, by default, associates the triggers in the background with something much more important that's happening in the moment with the handler. So the engagement is important, and it has to be dynamic engagement because it automatically puts the dog in the better learning state, which is activation and focus.
Can you elaborate on dynamic engagement? What do you mean by that specifically?
Yeah, dynamic because the movement is important. So anything that activates a dog, dogs tend to move more so than we do as humans. They want to move most of the time. When they're stressed, they want to move. When they're happy, they want to move. So not wanting to or preventing them from moving, that's conflict. So dynamic is just saying move with your dog. But again, move with your dog so that your dog actually wants to move with you, that your dog wants to stay engaged with you. Don't be a clown, don't be too fast, don't be too slow. Don't be like we humans would move, kind of learn how your dog moves and all these things. And there's some other elements that go into it. And that will ultimately, even without any commands, again, without any obedience, will draw your dog in and keep your dog's attention.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned a point a minute ago, like speaking about like arousal versus like calmness, and how a lot of people like try to achieve this state of calmness at all times, right? And they want the dog constantly in this state of being calm and stuff like that, which sure, like, like when I'm hanging out in my house with my dogs, I would like them to be in a state of being relatively chill, obviously, but I see it preached from this standpoint that, if the dog is not calm, we don't have the ability to influence their behavior properly or to control them or any of those types of things. And I've always seen that as such a weird cop out, because like I look at getting back to the sport side of things, and if you watch like Michael Ellis work his dogs or Ivan or any of these big name sport dog trainers and stuff, like those dogs are not in a state of being calm while they're working, but they're still very, very focused and they're very, very under control because they know how to work them in a state of arousal and be able to kind of manipulate their behavior appropriately that way, right? And I've always looked at needing the dog in a state of calm to keep themselves under control as, like I said, almost like a cop out of not knowing how to control the arousal in the first place, Yeah,
I think there's obviously a huge difference between working dogs and pet dogs, also the expectations, what they will have to do, the performance and all that. But there's also a huge genetic factor to it, right? Yep. So one of the big things is if you want to have a calm dog that just chills with you at a coffee shop, probably don't want to get a Vizsla, I don't know, on average, right?
Sure.
Wants to go pacing back and forth. But becoming, no matter what kind of dog you have, getting really comfortable with your dog's arousal is the number one skill everyone should learn from the very beginning. Not shy away from it, just really master how to steer the arousal level of a dog so that it doesn't turn into a super scattered, bouncing off the walls kind of behavior, because that will happen if you don't learn to become comfortable with that and learn how to steer the dog's movement and focus. But if you can, right, that's where really true training can happen, or true progress, or anything you want, really, because then the dog is also in a state of motivated. It's like, I have this energy, tell me what to do with this. It's like, okay, it's this and this and this, and now calm down.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, cool, I'm happy.
Yeah. I really like how you said being comfortable with your dog's arousal, because obviously for every dog that's going to look completely different, right? They're all going to have different levels of arousal, different things that get them aroused, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk for a minute on like ways that you see people, one, avoid their dog's arousal, right? Or not be comfortable with it in the first place, and things they could do to start being comfortable with the arousal? If that makes sense.
That's a good question. I think the biggest thing that you see probably also just on online is arousal that has either excitement attached to it or aggression, and that's where it gets tricky.
Sure.
What happens in the brain is actually very similar. It's just the motivation is a little bit different behind these behaviors. But that's where then the sit comes in, and no, and leave it, and place, and down, right? Because that's where we want it to be the opposite usually. So there's a lot of discomfort with, oh my God, my dog knocked over grandma, right? Out of excitement because he or she loves her. Oh my God, my dog is going to attack this dog out of whatever aggressive behavior. So the fear that we have with it, what the consequences might be, makes us really, really uncomfortable seeing our dogs being that aroused.
Sure.
So our natural instinct is to just put a lid on it, right? It's like, stop that. I'm embarrassed.
Yeah.
Instead of like, it's like, hey, I'm gonna, and this is really something that is tough because, humans also we judge each other, like you're not a good dog owner, you don't know what you're doing with this dog, I know better than you, right? So you feel embarrassed. And sometimes you kind of have to be with your voice and your emotions that you put in, kind of, very out there to get your dog's attention back.
Sure.
And if it's outside and it's like, hey, Bruno, let's go this way. Yay, you got a good boy, and you run the opposite direction, it might look weird to others.
Sure.
But it's just what it takes maybe to handle your dog in those moments. And that takes some practice and boldness.
Yeah, definitely. This is where I would say my love-hate relationship with commands like place and down and stuff come in, right? Because they are such good management skills that we could have, right? Like I always use the example of like when my grandmother-in-law comes over the house, right? She's, freaking 87 at this point and can't have my Malinois running underfoot while she's bringing things in, obviously. So I have to use, certain commands in order to manage him effectively in that moment. But if I'm constantly only ever using those commands to manage him in that moment, it's almost creating this buildup of excitement for when I go to release him, which is going to make him 10 times more energetic, And I see that a lot as we use like the place command, almost like a slingshot, where we put them on it and the dogs are like building themselves up. It's like then we release them and they take all that energy full bore towards whatever it is we're trying to keep them away from, where it's necessary sometimes, right? There are situations where you have to do that. But I try to coach people through addressing, why is the dog so stimulated when people are coming over in the first place, and combating that anticipation as well, right? So if people are coming right in and it's always the 15-minute love fest of the dogs as soon as they come in, obviously they're going to have that anticipation of all of that happening as soon as they get released off of the place board, right? So I feel like the management of those types of commands without addressing that side of things is just... It's so counterproductive. And I heard a trainer one time use the I think it probably a created definition on his part, but he talked about, physical restraint and then mental restraint. And I'm really curious to hear your opinions on this concept of mental restraint, of using obedience or, some sort of restraint that's not physical, obviously, in order to keep the dog away from things that they want to get to, and that creating tons of frustration and stress.
Yeah, so I think it's never black and white, and staying on your place bed, even though you want to come off. And that constantly testing, like, okay, now one paw is off, and now the other paw is off, and now my butt wiggles off, There the dog is not relaxed, right? It's just waiting for that moment. And working through this mental restraint or even physical restraint, working through certain levels of stress is incredibly important. Every dog should have that skill. We are living in like a society where there's constantly restraint. You have to stop at the traffic light. There's a car. There are babies running. Don't go there, right? Don't pick up the chicken wing bones. So much normal impulse control has to happen regardless. So if the dog doesn't learn to work through some of the stress and control impulses, just making everything harder. And we're going to have more anxiety.
Sure.
Medication, prescription, and all that. So I think it's important, but it takes some time. You have to take the time to teach that to your dog. You can't just expect that to happen, right? The dog, like little bouts of stress, and help your dog to work through stress, help your dog to not bounce immediately off the place, but challenge your dog in a way that is safe still, right? And where you are in a good headspace. Then you start doing this also in these situations. So my Melanie, right, is kind of very aroused when someone comes in, not out of excitement, just generally hates people,
sure.
And especially people coming in. And, like when someone comes in and I let her come to the living room, there is no go on your place bed immediately. That's not going to happen. First is like, hey, let's do an engagement training session. Don't worry, there's someone around, but we know how to do this together regardless. And that's the first 30 seconds. And it's like, okay, now go on your place bed. Don't worry about this. I'm here next to you. Here's something to do.
Yeah.
So I still help. We still get there. We still do these things, but
sure.
I don't expect her to do this in the very beginning. And the more you kind of set up these moments in training where there is mental restraint or physical restraint, the faster you will get your dog to not freak out. The faster is the roll down back to baseline
yep.
in exciting or stressful situations.
Yep, that makes sense. So with your dog, you use the example of like when you bring him into the living room because he does. You said he is he just apprehensive of new people or just gets too stimulated by them or okay.
Yeah, it's total stranger danger
type
of situation.
So when you bring him in and you do the engagement session, is your reasoning for that? To not immediately put him into a state of needing to contain all of those emotions, or what's kind of going on there?
I want to switch her. I want to switch her emotional state first. It's kind of like going from, who's that, to, oh, there's a training session.
Sure.
I know how to do that. And then she's much more willing to also follow, again, the engagement, the focus, sure. Right? To actually listen to me, what I have to say in those moments and follow my obedience. If she's really focused and at the end of the leash and bark, and then I say, place or leave it, right? She's just not, why would she do that in this moment? But if I say, hey, and it's like, what's up? It's like, come on, and then we go, I'll go on your place, but it's like, yeah, we've done this 1,000 times before. The only difference is there's someone I don't like, but I don't feel so bad about it anymore because mom just had fun with me and blah, 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 It's kind of like the switch that I want to have. I want to work with the arousal, switch the valence of stranger danger to, oh, training is fun. And then I layer in my calmness.
Yeah, that makes sense. What are your opinions on in a situation like that, utilizing punishment or corrections? Because it sounds like obviously you're utilizing those engagement sessions to get the dog refocused on you and training before doing it, right? What are your opinions on making like non-negotiables with some of those types of things? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. So, the whole topic punishment, it really depends. So with her, it's rather difficult because you can't, say a dog is, let's stick with the example of, stranger danger, someone coming in. All the aggression or the activation of what's happening in the brain is probably not responding to operant conditioning in that sense. You can't really reinforce it. People sometimes think they do. We can probably also not punish it. So that behavior itself, stopping it, might just put, again, more like a management, but you don't really teach the dog not to do it in that moment. So punishment.
Are you referring to punishing the act of the stranger danger right now?
Yeah.
Got it. I meant more so with, let's say, like non-negotiables as far as like non-compliance of, let's say, the place command in that moment. So we didn't have to do the full engagement routine prior to or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I use in particular with dogs like her that are like scatterbrained also easily, right?
Sure.
Instead of thinking it of as a punishment, I use the concept of prompting.
Sure.
And my prompting is kind of the non-negotiable. So I'm prompting you, but it's also very flexible, elastic in terms of the intensity of prompting it, right?
Yeah.
And the prompt is my physical cue. So usually I have for her a leash tap that I even do like group play, I put that in place.
Sure.
She knows really well, prompting me back onto mom and then continue play, whatever. And that prompting really changes in terms of intensity depending on the environment I'm in. So if I go outside on a walk and there's not necessarily anything that is threatening her, but something that is distracting her, but I actually do want to train, I prompt with the leash tap. She knows the leash tap really well. So I don't want her to feel punished. I want her to feel prompted to the alternative.
Sure.
But I also want her to understand that this prompt means alternative is happening if you want it or not, right? So that's kind of like the adding fuel to the fire by prompting to the alternative without having to say stop.
Sure.
Or without having to punish the non-compliance, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Versus like something like a no marker or like a punishment that you use for like obedience and
Sure.
Really disobeying in these moments is a little bit different there, because there it's more like an you know exactly how to move your body and how to obey a command, for example. But you didn't do it in that moment in the training session. I use my no marker or whatnot. That kind of punishment to communicate that was definitely wrong. But in the situation with like stranger danger, reactivity, I don't see it as this is wrong. I'm just prompting and really making sure I understand the alternative behavior is the better choice in that sense.
Sure. So is your engagement that you do kind of I know you said you use the leash pressure as the example of the prompt, right? So would you hypothetically in that scenario, right, you would bring the dog out, right? And when you wanted to get her engagement on you, you would give your prompt with the leash pressure, which is signaled to mean that, hey, pay attention to mom, we're about to do engagement drills or whatever it may be. Is that kind of your idea of prompting the dog prior to doing whatever, your place command or whatever you do after that?
Yeah, so I have my verbal prompt that usually goes out the window with the more the excitement or arousal kicks in. And then I have my follow-up with my physical prompt. So for me, it's always 2 leash taps. Leash taps. Tap, tap means prompt.
Yep.
Turn around. Whatever you do, come here. It's never 3. It's never 1. It's 2.
Sure.
It's really exactly that for as a cue or command almost, if you will. Versus, when I use the leash for actually leash pressure when I train other things. So she understands the difference. And then, then it's like, yay. And then we go into our dynamic engagement.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So obviously in using that, you're essentially conditioning that the 2 prompts means good things are coming from you, right? Mm-hmm. So obviously in order for owners to start doing something like that in the presence of triggers, like you said, there's going to be prerequisites that they have to meet prior to going in that situation, working it not around the triggers, right? Stuff like that. How do you effectively go about implementing that gradually where, let's say hypothetically, even those 2 taps on the leash, right, go out the window, right? Similar to a verbal prompt in that moment. You don't have to continue intensifying those taps until it hits a point where the dog is motivated enough by it. You get what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How
so
do you manage that, I guess, in the house, with your personal dog? Or how did you manage that, I should say?
It's kind of like the 80-20 rule, right? So you never stop, obviously, using it. And 80% of the time, you use it when there's no trigger. 20% of the time, there is a trigger or something that you really needed to work.
Got it.
And in order for it not to intensify more and more and more, it's just a matter of becoming so reflexive and automatic that the dog is much more likely to, without thinking about it. It's like, oh, I feel this, I turn around. I feel this, I turn around. And the other way is like, the other reason also, the other requirement is, why am I turning around?
Sure.
I'm not going to turn around for a piece of food.
Of course, yeah.
Probably. And kind of that is really the first starting point to make that engagement such a huge win for the dog. And, sports dog trainers, they really have that down because they need to, because the dog has to perform at such high levels. They need this motivation. Pet dog owners, I think they often lack that skill because they don't feel like they have to unless they have to. But then it's a huge mess, right?
Yeah.
So making this such a rewarding activity it's teamwork, It's not working against your dog because your dog is doing something you don't want. It's still teamwork, and you got to be worth someone working with for your dog.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, sport dog trainers, I do think, because they're always practicing for the big event, right, which is their trial or whatever it may be, that they're running the dog through so many of these drills and conditioning in these kind of reward responses and stuff like that with the dog. Like it really is like something that I think a lot of pet dog owners, I should say, can learn a lot from, because a lot of times when pet dog owners go to implement this stuff, it's always in the situation where they desperately need it, and there's no practice or preparation leading up to that point, which is where you get that like butting heads with your dog constantly. It's like, we've never done this before. Now, in the absolute hardest possible place for me to perform this task, you're now going to require absolute excellence of me. It's wild.
I think one of the a big thing too, like you said it way earlier about like Michael Ellis, like these sport dog trainers have these high drive, you watch the dogs and they're wound up, but they're like tentative at every point. And it's like, I feel like these, regular people like me, if they have these high strung dogs, they almost try to, they think that high strung way is like bad. So they almost kind of are trying to downplay what their dog really is. Like you were saying, like this is an excited genetic dog. And I think the thing that kind of gets hairy is when they're trying to use the obedience and the training to kind of almost change their dog instead of working with their dog, knowing, hey, yeah, you are high drive and we need to work with that. And does that make sense? Like, I feel like that's what you're kind of doing with there. Where it's just like you kind of you what you have with that dog is going to be high drive, like it, and you kind of have to work with it instead of smush it down. Yeah,
you definitely have to understand like what your dog's baseline is with stuff, and not be surprised when they act in a way where their baseline is like that. And like I said, like commands and stuff are great for managing, the way that I've always viewed them, obviously. But the baseline of who the dog is still always going to be there, right? You're not going to transform them into the super calm, chill golden retriever Malinois, right? Like that's not necessarily going to happen. And I learned that the hard way with my dog. Like so Vinny, my Malinois, I got him very, very young. I got him like maybe 10 years ago or so to do Mondio ring with, right? And I competed with him for a while. And then when my business started taking off, he transitioned to pet dog life, right? Like he is the retired pet dog Malinois at this point. And when I made that switch, it was like the amount of butting heads that I did with him was unbelievable, because I just wanted him to be like, my pity or whatever, who just sleeps all day long and is calm as can be all the time, And until I really like accepted a lot of his quirks and a lot of the things that he does and like who he is, like our relationship never got to the place it is now, which now I say I have like my best relationship with him out of all of my dogs. And that's a lot of what I try to do when I'm working with clients is first and foremost, get them to accept like who the dog is, right? Which kind of gets to an interesting segue, which is, genetic predispositions with dogs and, how much you think, I don't want to say how much you think that impacts training, because obviously it impacts it a great deal, obviously, but how much flexibility you think there is with helping dogs overcome certain genetic predispositions, like either a lot of fear, right? Or a lot of, I don't know if assertiveness or quote unquote dominance, right? Is an accurate predisposition that a dog can have, obviously, but how much flexibility you think there is as far as dogs overcoming some of those types of things?
That's a good question. There's certainly some flexibility, but again, you're not gonna flip the script completely on who the dog is and the personality. You might get a good hang of it, and you might get to a point where there are no problems whatsoever with whatever behavior, but it obviously takes a lot of work and vigilance. And for some dogs, if you take your eyes off, or you go on a vacation and the dog is in a boarding school or doggy daycare for a week, comes back completely like it was before, and your 5 years of training are back, because they kind of just fall back into certain behaviors very, very quickly.
Yeah.
but it also, again, depends a lot on what kind of breed and, what is the behavior very much associated with who the dog is. So if it's a dog, it's a hunting dog, and there's a lot of digging involved, and there's a lot of, sniffing, and you can have them pulling on the leash, they'll probably very likely fall back to baseline if you stop being consistent with, your management, or stop being consistent with how you handle the dog. Something that is for Bagel, sorry. I know a beagle whose name is Bagel, so
That's hilarious. Yeah.
Bagel the beagle. So for Beagle, is like just very vocal and loves barking.
Yes.
Right? You can probably certainly teach the quiet command, but if left alone for a week and given all the choices,
Yes.
dog is probably going to wanting to bark again and hear his or her own voice.
Yeah.
So how much it is really aligned with the genetics and the functional genetics, if you will. These kind of behaviors are probably a little harder. Other behaviors, if it's fearfulness, skittishness, I think, unless it's just nervousness that comes also with a very active dog, I think that you have a lot more chance to actually get to a point where the dog's just confident and doesn't react as much anymore.
Yes.
Or be as anxious anymore. And that's probably takes also some time, but you're less likely to fall back into it once the dog realizes, like, hey, I'm actually cool.
Yeah. Yeah, the fearfulness one is interesting. So, yeah, why do you feel that particular, we'll call it genetic quirk that a dog has is, like you said, easier to long-term overcome for them, if I understood what you just said correctly?
Yeah, so it's when we think about fearfulness or anxiousness, or especially from starting as a puppy, we as humans, our first emotions is anxiety in terms of what's happening, uncertainty, and the same for puppies. And what's really happening is because everything is new at the beginning, there are two types of dogs, right? And I happen to have both of them, right? So Anya is like, everything is new by default, threat, right?
Yes.
And then my German Shepherd, everything is new by default, great. I want to explore more,
Yes.
right? So the behavior attached to it is very different. So that's kind of the genetic predisposition that you see in different types of puppies at the beginning.
Yeah.
But even if everything at the beginning is a threat, this fork in the decision-making of what behavior to follow, that fork is not as dominant anymore as the dog learns that it's not a threat, it's not a threat, it's not a threat. It's just a classic kind of habituation.
Yes.
That has to happen at the pace that works for the dog, because the dog has to be able to make the right decision. But if the dog makes the right decision, because you set it up that way, that the dog learns not a threat, not a threat, not a threat, that initial fork decision making of, oh, something is new, am I going to be threatened, or is it safe? Because you have these thousands, hundreds of repetitions where it wasn't a threat. Then it's just classic conditioning.
Yes.
Where the dog isn't that fearful anymore to new environments or to new things, right?
Yeah.
That you have a lot of control over. You just got to do it the right way.
Yeah. Yeah. In one of your posts that I saw earlier, you mentioned one of the big keys for success being the ability to control your environment. And I think there was one other thing also. But, with the fearful dogs, I think, I've seen a lot of dogs be able to massively overcome that, habituation of like something's new, it's a threat, something new, it's a threat, right? Which I like how you articulated that, obviously. But by controlling and ensuring that every single time they get a new situation, that it never is actually a threat. Yeah, the generalization and reconditioning of that, I feel like, can just massively compound on itself. But like this, it feels like the second you don't adequately control that, and there is a situation that is a threat in that moment, they just totally derail again. You know what I mean? Which is why I would say, like, can they really hit a point where it's like they get reconditioned so well that they could that those things don't impact them as much? Does that make sense?
So you're saying you did all the work, you did right.
Yes.
And
then they have a bad situation, right? Like,
and then a bad situation.
Yeah. Does that totally then derail them if all of our environmental control stops? You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
does the dog ever actually change, or did we just long term really, really manage them well? Really, really manage the environments that they were in well, you know?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's kind of like you do all this work,
Yeah.
and maybe you even started out with a fearful reactive dog. You did all this
Sure.
work, and you can go now on walks, and you pass by other dogs, and you can ignore them. And then one day, your dog get attacked, actually,
Sure.
rushed by an off-leash dog, and it turns out into a fight. That's obviously a very traumatic event. Now, is the dog going back to who he was before, which is super anxious, super reactive, or do you have enough foundational work put in for the dog to overcome and then just continue where you stopped
Yes.
before the attack?
Yes.
Again, it depends on the personality, but in my experience, there will be a phase after where everything is shit again, and everything seems to be back to where it was before.
Sure. Yeah.
But it will flip very quickly
Yeah.
to the point where the dog is okay.
Yeah.
I think I'm good again.
Yeah. 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 They'll overcome it faster, is what you're saying, than the
Right.
first time. Yeah. Yeah.
I think they overcome it faster. If you do not have all that stuff put in place,
Yeah.
I think then it's just, oh, I knew it.
Yeah.
It's not worth not being afraid.
Yeah.
There's something going to happen. Couldn't rely on whatever I have. And, and this is the same, this trauma response in general is kind of like, is that there is kind of like an aftermath where everything, vigilance, cortisol, stress, everything stays higher.
Yeah.
And it's not just for a couple hours, it can be for weeks. And that's very natural of the fear response, because the fear response has to make sure you're not going to be in the same situation again. So the fear response kind of stays active in that sense, saying, don't go back there. Don't do the same mistakes again.
Yes.
You were like close to dying.
Yeah.
So you have to wait for that to come down, and then you kind of expose your dog again and kind of like, see, it wasn't as bad. If the fear response is still high and you kind of immediately go back to expect everything to be normal, the dog will be, we call it the trigger stacking that can last for weeks, because everything is still active, even the aggressiveness potentially,
Yeah.
the rage, it's still active. So you kind of have to wait for that a little bit to flatten out, and then you kind of just, your own anxiety also has to be,
Yes.
you got to be chill again,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then you go your way.
Yeah. It's interesting, like, when we'll have clients that say they had like a major setback with things or an incident or whatever it may be, the hardest thing I feel like for owners is to move forward from it and not completely change their outlook on the entire situation, And I feel like, and this is where I'm interested to hear your take on it as well. A lot of times, like, let's say, a client has a dog that's a little bit fearful and they go for walks every day and it's always fine. It's great. Everybody's happy. And then one day they get like rushed by an off leash dog or something. Right. Mm-hmm. And it feels like a major setback. And then the next week, right, every time the owner goes out for a walk, they are anticipating the off-leash dog coming out and rushing. So they're constantly doing different things with the dog, and they're tensing up on their leash more where they never used to do it before. And they're essentially triggering the dog in that moment to kind of feel like, hey, something bad is about to happen. Where a lot of those same dogs, I feel like, and this is my bro science coming out, if you go right back to your walks like nothing ever happened, so many of them just they fall right back into their routines like it's not a problem. So I'm interested to hear your take on what might be going on in the dog's head in those situations, if it's something different than that,
You mean what's going on if the owner continues to be anxious?
Yeah. So how the owner's behavior, hold on, let me rephrase this. If the owner's behavior in that moment plays almost more a role in the dog's behavior moving forward after that incident.
I think it's 50-50. So the owner is just like is obviously at the end of the leash, but it's just another component of the entire context, what it means to be on the walk.
Sure.
And if anything is off, and obviously the relationship with the owner is the most important one in that context, if anything is off, if even the gate door of that dog rushing out is now always open, even though it was closed before.
Sure.
Anything changed, the dog will pick that up.
Yeah.
Right? And it's the closest to pick up anything that changed in the behavior of the owner, right? And that will make the dog even more suspicious. Dogs are very, very detail oriented. They pick up some dogs not as much as others, but they pick up on details very, very quickly and easily that we don't even see. And these details mean your breathing, right? You walk a little faster. When at the beginning, when my Melanie, when she was younger, and she would react to every person walking outside. She just, there's a person, I don't know, I'm gonna, just in case, make myself heard, right? And my husband, when he would walk her, as soon as he saw a person, he would speed up.
Sure.
Everything would be loose. He would have the leash loose. He would continue in the normal voice, but he would speed up a little bit.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I didn't know that. And I was like, why is she still doing this? Like, I'm doing all this work, and then he takes her for a walk. And then we walk together, and then I realized he's speeding up. He's just slightly speeding up. And he wasn't really aware of this either, because he just wanted to get out of the situation quickly. But that became a cue for, something is around. So she became even more vigilant and was seeking out the threat, which is the classic definition of anxiety, right? You're anticipate stress, anticipate a threat. So now kind of like forcing yourself to stay calm and start talking to your dog as if something really great is happening can help yourself calm down too, and not make such a big deal out of it, so that your dog gets actually a chance to overcome that. So, but again, that could be even, I don't know, anything else in the environment that is off.
Yeah.
That can make the dog more vigilant. You just, as the handler, probably the one who has the most cues of normal versus not normal.
Yeah. And does it not so much matter what the cue is, as far as you just want to reverse whatever the negative one is? Like, so you use the example of, obviously, with your husband, him speeding up on the walk, obviously, and that became a cue for her to start being hyper vigilant of like, wait, something might be happening right now, right? Because it consistently was happening when there were probably threats around, right? Where if you flip that and use the example of talking to your dog and, in a positive way or something along those lines, just because of the sheer fact that it's something new that isn't conditioned into all of those other things can help break the pattern. Is that kind of the idea? Is you create change?
Yeah, it's a good question. So generally, ideally, you just want it to be as normal as possible. Yes. Whatever you did before, continue doing it, right? Yeah. What triggers dogs is the contrast moment, right? Yes. Something that was not there before is now there.
Yes.
Technically, that could be even your voice, you starting to talk to your dog sweetly. If you never talk to your dog on walks, right? That could be...
Because we see that as a big trigger a lot as well, right? As people, they start getting nervous and they start talking to the dog like, hey, don't worry, it's a dog. It's like, it's going to be okay, right? And that becomes then the negative pattern that conditions the dog. The second they start talking to them, it's like, boom, I'm ready to start freaking exploding on shit, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's really it doesn't really matter what the cue is. It's really the contrast that dogs pick up on.
Sure.
And if it's contrast though, and when we talked about the dynamic engagement and the focus cue and all these things, I do that all the time, even if there's no one around, even if there's not a dog around, right? That's what we meant when we said, put that in place before, make this a normal thing on walks, if reactivity is a thing. So that it doesn't become, we only do this when there's something. Well, now today I'm going to decide to react and not engage with you. Yeah. And then you start on prompting more or correcting or leave it or no, and you get frustrated. And then you say, this doesn't work, right? But it's the learning how dogs learn, and we need to understand a little bit more. Like, everything has to be 80% of the time as it is normal doing this. This is my picture of when I go on a walk, any moment I could get redirected on my owner, we could have some fun, then we continue walking. Any moment. Oh, there's a trigger? Well, I'm still falling into something that I know really well.
Yep. Yeah, I like that. Okay, so this will kind of, we're kind of slowly segueing into the real conversation with like a lot of the emotions and stuff. So one thing I feel like we as dog trainers say all the time is dogs live in the moment and don't dwell on the past. I would say that's something I hear so many dog trainers say. And I'm looking to hear you, I guess, debunk that if that's not totally accurate. Or get your opinion on that phrase just in general, I guess.
It's a good one. It depends on what we would mean by dwelling in the past.
Sure.
Because dogs don't dwell in the past as humans do, but they also don't look into the future as humans do.
Yeah,
right?
so that right there, what you just said, that's what I'm looking to hear more about. Because that's the thing that I think throws off like owners and trainers
Yeah.
and everybody, is exactly how you just said that right there.
Okay. Okay. So, in terms of learning, right? As I said before, it's putting life into context, and the brain, every brain, has really two main functions.
Yeah.
It's maintaining all your bodily functions, so you breathe, your heart beats, whatever it is,
Yes.
and predicting what's happening next for maximum survival. So now for us humans, we can predict, we're trying to predict 10 years, 20 years, our entire lives, right?
Okay.
And we get anxious. I have to pay a mortgage for 30 years, right? What might happen if I can't?
Sure.
Dogs don't have that capacity. Their brain still predicts what might happen any given moment. And that might be cued in contextual cues, wherever environment they're in. Mom is coming home, I'm going to get a treat. Leash, it's clipping on, I'm going to react, right? So there's a chain of cues that the brain uses to predict what might happen next. Now, if you had to ask me how many minutes and in advance, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily in the moment, because prediction per se by definition means not being in the moment, but what's next.
Yes.
It's just not as complex and elaborate as it is for humans, right?
Yeah.
And that's the brain, and that's what determines the behavior.
Yes.
The cues put the dog into a certain state of mind, emotional state, if you will, and that determines the behavior. And it's all because of the cues that the dog learned to interpret what's happening next.
Is that due to like actual like differences in the brain, or is that due to, so you were explaining a lot of different things humans will dwell on in the future, the freaking mortgage, is my girlfriend gonna leave me, is like 10,000 different examples of things that can happen. Is that because our brain is that much different than theirs as far as our capacity to do that, or is that because like the society our species lives in just has so much more stuff going on in it? Does that make sense?
No, it's absolutely the capacity. It's the brain functions itself. So if you were to compare a human brain and a dog brain, for one, the size is much bigger. But what really matters is the size of the area, prefrontal cortex, the folds, what we think of a brain, the foldy mass. That is much more complex and much more developed in humans, which allow us to have these complex thoughts, develop AI, this kind of stuff. It's a lot flatter, smooth, the surface, and smaller in dogs. So they can't have these, we call this sometimes executive functions, as complex as we humans do. All the other stuff that is very instinctive, fight or flight response, these kind of things are very preserved. Yes, the size also differs a little bit, but the capacity of running when you feel threatened is the same. We kind of act almost the same when we feel threatened. We start a fight, potentially we run away, the same as dogs do or any other animals, right? So these very instinctive behaviors, they're very much preserved or conserved between species.
Okay, that makes sense. So is it the complexion in which they're able to like predict things in the future, or is it more of a time thing? I know you said obviously you don't know exact times and stuff like that, which isn't what I'm asking, but are we able to predict and dwell on more things in the future because we could simply predict further into the future?
Yeah, so we create this is where all these discussions happen. We create realities that are not real yet, but we think they're real, right? Because we have the capacity of imagining something that someone said and interpreting it. It's never happened.
I understand.
And dogs don't do that, right? Yes. They just like, what's there?
Yeah.
And what does that mean for my survival or my benefits? Do I gain anything from it, or do I need to avoid it? And they can only do what they basically have learned, right? So there's like these two processes. What have I learned in terms of repetitions, reinforcement? based on the cues and what am I sensing right now, what I'm seeing, hearing, tasting, feeling, and all these things. And that's can change any given moment, right?
Yes.
But for humans, right, we take this with us. We do wherever we want, worry about things that are not even there.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense when you described it as like we could literally craft a scenario that has never ever happened before, and make that something new that we will then dwell on, right? And have this false reality of something that might happen that is we've never experienced before in our lives, where dogs do not have the ability to dwell that much on that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
So what?
Or if they do, we don't know. I mean, if they do, we don't know. It's very impossible.
That's true.
Yeah, and that's kind of the tough thing about this is as we've been discussing it over the last few podcasts, I've tried to do some independent research on just little things. Like a lot of people talk about how, do dogs love us or not love us, which is another one that I'm very interested to hear your opinion on, obviously. Or a lot of people use the example of my dog knows when I'm sick and wants to console me when I'm sick and those types of things. And I tried to look into what sorts of actual studies have been done to prove one way or another. And all of them kind of keep coming back to we don't really know. Okay, yeah, the love one, for example, there's obvious signs that with an owner, right, dogs have a much more positive association with that individual than they will with other people, right? But then you get into this deep, complex, what is love in the first place, and does that emotion equate to it? Is it the exact same thing with humans and with dogs and all of that kind of stuff? It just all was very gray, and it's almost the further down the rabbit hole you get, the more confusing it kind of gets,
Yeah.
So I guess I'm curious on that one then. So as far as dogs loving, people or those types of situations, what's your take on some of that?
It's these kind of discussions around feelings or emotions is. Not that I try to avoid it, but I don't have satisfying, like you said, there is just no satisfying answer to it. But I feel like we humans, especially pet owners, not necessarily the researchers who conduct these studies, but they might be motivated by what the public is interested in.
Sure.
It's we want our dogs to love us. And do everything for us and take a bullet for us or be very sad when we leave. And it makes me really wonder why. Why is that? Right? Because again, we're creating realities here. We're putting something on dogs that might even be there. But it's so powerful because I think we kind of want to fill our own needs in terms of how we want the relationship to be with the dog. Now, if there was a study that would say your dog doesn't care about you at all, I don't think they would accept it. I think there would be such an outrage. Everyone would say, no, it's impossible. I see it every single day. So, but really it comes down to feelings, and feelings are not necessarily the same as emotions, and feelings are very subjective.
That's a good
and
way to put that.
Unless our dogs can actually tell us in the language that we understand without any ambiguity that they feel love and sadness, we will never know. And that's just it. No study in this world will be able to confirm it because the only thing we have left to extrapolate any kind of feelings is by looking at the behavior.
Yes.
And that gets very dangerous.
Very subjective.
Very subjective. And one behavior can look emotional, but might be automatic. One behavior could look like they love us, right? The classic, I'm rolling on my back, but actually want you to leave alone. So the interpretations are just not accurate.
Yeah. How do you look at feelings and emotions as different? How do you define the differences between the two?
So emotions, I see this, and this is coming from other researchers that have kind of neuroscientists kind of facing the same things. I want to know if animals have emotions without having to rely on subjective feelings or the definition of subjective feelings. And especially in the field of neuroscience, it ultimately comes down to an emotion is kind of a brain state with all the activations and hormones and neurotransmitters, right? Lots of things at this very moment are going on that kind of define an emotional state, and that influences the behavior. So instead of feeling, which is an introspective kind of consciousness of when you, for example,
I
hunger
understand.
versus
Yeah.
feeling hungry, right?
Sure.
Like I know I'm hungry because I have this consciousness of my body signals and I need to eat, so I feel hungry or
Yeah.
feel loved or feel sad. It's, this consciousnness of it.
Sure.
Do animals have this consciousness? I don't know.
Sure.
So we
Sure.
can't
Sure.
really.
Sure. Okay.
So
I
the
understand.
feelings are really just the subjective. It's kind of looking into your brain.
Yeah.
And I feel hungry versus the emotion is what's actually that particular state that's happening right now that determines behavior.
Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, but the feelings then would be the obviously your interpretation of how you're feeling, right? So
Correct.
it's whatever you craft as far as like, this is what this means, which is where we really got down the rabbit hole with things, where we started talking then about human emotions. And I was like, do we really like have we almost overcomplicated emotions and feelings for ourselves a little too much because of our ability to reason and craft these futures or whatever it may be, like so intensely that we've overcomplicated them past just the basic primal, way that you would assume that animals kind of learn them. And then does that get to, the kind of secondary part, which is the difference between human and dog feelings or emotions, right? We'll just say emotions, obviously, and why we're not able to truly understand each other's emotions. Does that make sense? Because we've overcomplicated them for ourselves, right? Where dogs obviously have not done that, or we don't know if they have done that, but we don't necessarily think that they have. So when we try to put a lot of these kind of complex human emotions and feelings on the dog doesn't know what to make of that. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Okay.
Yeah. So we barely can figure out our own brain, how it works, right? Like a lot of things we take from human psychology and then we try to plot it on a lot of other species, including dogs, because they kind of share lives with us, right? And like this, we all heard of it. It's like someone who, I don't know, goes to therapy because it's like angry. I feel angry. It's like, no, you're not angry. You're really just hurt. This becomes so complex, like why you're hurt or because you're actually, and it goes on and on and on, right? And we just talk about it. But if that's kind of like the subjectivity of these feelings and kind of communicate and understand it and misunderstanding it. But because that's the only way how we relate to each other most of the time, more so how we feel rather than actual logic. That's how we want our dogs to feel too. And it's not so much that we do this on purpose because we desperately need a dog to love us. It's more like, this is what love looks like because of my own subjective feelings and what I've experienced, right?
Yeah.
And for dogs, it's kind of, I guess it is rooted and has some level of misunderstandings, but it's really, a dog comes over and licks the lips, right? Yeah. And then a human might be like, oh, my dog loves me so much. Versus you just had a peanut butter bread and your dog really just licking the peanut butter off your lips, right? And the next day is like, oh, that's how we show love. And I go and then do the same with my dog and I lean in and my dog is like totally freaked out in that moment because taking a nap and then bites my lip, right? It's like, my dog hates me now. It's like such a betrayal, right? And again, it's all driven by these feelings we have towards each other. And I feel like there's no trust between us anymore. And the dog is like, I was just being a dog the entire time, right? So we can kind of remove that kind of how we try to relate to our dogs. It's not so much on feelings and more so on what we observe, but also kind of just not putting this blueprint of feelings onto them. Yeah. I think we will have less of a misunderstanding. Yeah. And get a little bit closer to really understanding what the species dog really is, right? There's more and more research done now, but there's a really powerful movement of these concepts of human psychology, feelings, giving consent. It's a huge topic that we put on our dogs. And I feel like we're taking away space to really learn who dogs really are and how we can best make this really chaotic life that is so stressful at times the best possible experience for both of us, meaning both species.
I like that. Now, the way I feel like I personally try to weed through some of the whatever, the cloud of BS, if you want to call it, or whatever it is, when you get into these like emotional conversations and stuff with dogs, is I really try to just pragmatically look at like the behavior that we're exhibiting, or we're seeing, right? And that we're trying to make sense of, and try to just use the most basic of logic to ask myself, like, why might the dog be doing this thing or not doing this thing? Like you use the example of the dog comes up and gives him kisses, and it's like, oh my God, like he's giving kisses, he loves you. But in your case, you're like, no, you literally just ate peanut butter, and the dog likes peanut butter, so obviously wants to lick your mouth in that moment, right? Yeah. Can we get too far down that rabbit hole though, where we simply look at things, like where we try to find a practical reason why the dog might be doing a certain thing, but we're missing underlying emotional things?
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think it's still probably safer to go as simple as possible.
Sure.
If you want to find an explanation, what is the most simple explanation? And you're probably on the right track.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's so many nuances. Otherwise, you wouldn't have, all these research going on in terms of how does the brain work when there's aggression, right? When there's fear and all these things. But in terms of, what does it mean for you and how you interact with your dog? I don't think we need to make it super complicated, because, for dog, it's really just like, okay, so now this is where it starts, because if I say this, am I still going to say it?
I'm ready.
People will be like, but it's so more complex than this. There's so much more that goes into it.
Yeah.
Yes, it's true, but you can still, there's like this first principles kind of concept: withdraw or approach, appetitive or aversive. Yeah. That's the law of nature.
What were the second two? What were the second two you said there?
Appetitive or aversive.
What was what was that first one? Appetitive, you said?
Withdraw or approach.
Got it. Yeah. And then you said was it appetitive? Is that what you said?
Yeah, appetitive. Yeah.
What is that?
So appetitive is like appetite, right? You want it.
Understood.
You go.
Understood. Yeah.
And the opposite is aversive.
Yes.
And this is just like super research experiment setup kind of language. So we don't really use these terms as much. But you can really, almost every behavior, kind of put it down in these two kind of categories. What is the motivation behind it? Why is it appetitive? Why is it aversive? What has the dog learned? What are the genetics? Who is involved? What about the handler? Yes, they all influence that, but at the end of the day, it's still in terms of, what the brain really wants: maximum survival, reproduction. So avoid things that are not good for you and go to things that are good for you, right?
Yes.
And before we can add all these nuances, which I think are super interesting nuances, where you kind of make the difference between an average sport dog and a dog that might be winning competitions,
sure,
given genetics the same, right? This is where nuances can really make differences, and it's super interesting. But it's hard. It's hard to kind of find out what really matters in terms of how we handle dogs.
Yeah. So this is very interesting. So you used obviously those 4 different things, and you said you basically can take most behaviors and categorize them within like a spectrum of all of those. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is literally what got me into trouble on the internet, as far as all the people in the comments saying like, no, like that's wrong, this, that, probably the same thing like you just described of what people do with you with it. So I created in my mind, and I'm curious if this is similar or if you think there's a flaw in this, I created a spectrum, right? So like basically a chart that was safety and danger, and then aroused and we'll just say calm. I don't remember what the exact words I used for it, right? And I basically said any behavior you see with your dogs can fit on a spectrum of one of those, of those things, right? So take dog reactivity, for example. With every dog, obviously, different dogs react for different reasons, obviously. But let's say we have a dog that's fearful of other dogs and reacting to try to gain space, right? That would be an example of an aroused danger, right? You could chart it on that graph that way, right? Or a dog jumping when guests come over the house, right? Because they really like the guests. You could chart that as, aroused safety, right? The person is very safe. They like them. They want to be close to them, but they're also very stimulated in that moment. And I basically was just going through every list of behaviors that people would say, hey, my dog is doing this for some complex reason, and plotted it like onto that chart, and I used that to basically say, I personally, based on, my bro science and logic, feel dogs can only really understand emotions within that spectrum, right? So I'm curious to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, so it's really about the arousal level, and then you give a valence to it, positive or negative, right? So the arousal positive or negative? Is it sleeping because it's positive and feeling safe, or is like knocked out kind of? Knock the dog out kind of thing, right? So that would be negative. So you kind of give a valence on the scale of arousal in your schema.
Yes.
And I think a while back, when I was thinking more about this, I kind of did the same exercise as in kind of plot everything that I observe in dogs on that, right? Yeah. And sometimes when it gets complicated, this is the thing, when it gets complicated, it really gets complicated because we don't know exactly what's going on in the dog's brain, but the outcome is still the same. The outcome is still, is the dog aroused and wants to move? Is the dog super calm? It gets complicated when the dog is seemingly calm, breezes up, right? But is actually aroused because of danger, right? But then you would probably give it a negative valence in that sense, right? So it still applies to this. In terms of the emotion or in relation to emotions, this is still, so the behavior that you see in the emotion is what drives the behavior. So the behavior itself is not the emotion, being aroused.
Yes, I understand. Yeah.
The emotion is leading to increased heartbeat and whatnot.
Sure.
Or the emotional state, if you will. And that, again, is where the complexity comes in. But we really don't know.
That's the hard part, right? It's like, there's no sound answers.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That was interesting, though, how you described that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the input and the output. We can observe the output. We can guess what the input is. And what the black box in between, the emotional state, is complex. But again, there's just so much output, different variation of outputs that you can read, which can probably fit on your schema. You have to go through more mental exercises to see if it's true.
Yeah.
But what's in between,
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah, you still have to kind of reverse engineer that output and figure out, when you ultimately look at what's important, which is solving whatever that issue is, right? You still have to kind of reverse engineer it back to its core to fix whatever that root problem is, and that's where, we have to kind of be a little bit more complex ourselves as far as trying to figure out that solution. So that's interesting. Okay, so you mentioned a minute ago, consent, right? And I did see a post that you made where you kind of, it sounded like had a little bit of a mixed opinion on consent as far as it not being what we claim it to be sometimes when it comes to dogs. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, there are two issues with this. So consent behavior, teaching consent behavior is, you find lots of protocols for it, and I don't think anything is wrong with how you teach that dog, right? So you should go through this in terms of teach your dog to hold still, and when I trim the nails, nothing bad happens, and then you get rewarded and that whole stuff, right?
Sure.
It becomes problematic when we say the dog is giving consent, what consent really means, because consent, again, comes from human psychology. And this word has been created because our capability of creating future realities that can allow us to determine whether this is beneficial for us or not, even if we have never encountered that situation in our lives before. And we even put an age limit to it when a person has the maturity to give consent, right? We don't say a 12-year-old can give consent to certain things, right, for a reason, because doesn't understand future actions as much. Now we're taking that kind of consent definition wanting to put it on dogs gets very, very difficult because dogs can't do that. You have to go through training. The question is, if you have to train a dog to show whether or not the dog is willing to endure the handling or not, is it really consent? I don't think so. It's just
you're manipulating them into it. Yeah.
Yes. It's cooperation.
Yes.
Approaching it or staying away from it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, let's just say it's consent, right? Is it really beneficial to always have our dogs decide whether or not they go through that procedure? Because what I want my dog is being prepared for life, not just for living room life, right? Not just for I'm sitting down with her, trimming her nails, and if she doesn't want to do it anymore, she just moves away and gets rewarded for it.
Yeah.
That doesn't help situations where she has to go to the vet because maybe she ripped her paw and there's a splinter and they will have to remove it or else it gets infected.
Yeah.
Now she learned that if she doesn't want to, she just needs to walk away.
Yeah.
Like, no, not at the vet. Now it becomes a really traumatic experience because now the dog is like, wait a second.
Yeah.
Every time I walked away, I was allowed to walk away. Now I'm not. I'm going to die because it's horrible.
Yeah.
And now you're actually creating a really traumatic event that can then affect your future training when you want to handle the dog again.
Yeah.
So I think it's problematic in that sense because teaching a dog to cooperate is a very gradual process. And you go by rewarding and building up to it. And all that training should happen. You don't need to force the dog to sit through something from the very beginning. But there's also an element where, like, we did that, and now you also have to do it a little bit, just a little bit longer, to learn to mental restraint. We talked about this before.
Yeah.
Physical restraint, to learn to work through stress so that when you really, really have to, you're not freaking out and have a traumatic experience.
Yep, that makes sense. Do you think that dogs can understand contextual consent? And first, let me start by saying, I actually, when I think of the word consent, did not think of it from the standpoint of how you just described it, which is being able to predict not just if they want something in the moment or not, but is it good for me in the future? Like that is, you're obviously, that makes complete sense that is 100% a human thing, right? Like we have the ability to reason into the future, which is why we put an age limit on it, et cetera, right? I guess I've always looked at consent as something more simple than that, which is, do they want this thing in the moment or do they not want this thing in the moment? Mm-hmm. So I preface that by saying what I'm about to say, I'm using that kind of definition of, right? Mm-hmm. So contextual consent, meaning like, yes, there are numerous things in my day-to-day with my dogs that are, non-negotiables. We got to do them, right? If I need to do your nails, I need to do your nails, right? Yeah, I'll try to make it as pleasant of an experience as possible. Going to the vet, I'll try to make it as pleasant of an experience as possible. But some of these things are non-negotiables. You don't have the ability to give consent for it. You just have to do it, right? But when it comes to my dog's interactions with, say, my guests, that's one place where I do implement a quote unquote consent policy, right? Like if somebody comes over my house and wants to interact with one of my dogs, they have to use their best judgment on, does the dog actually want the interaction in this moment or not? And usually I use just a simple protocol of like, casually try to call the dog over to you and see, like, do they come over or do they say, nah, you're a little weird right now, I don't really want to. And if you see that, like, we're not going to push the envelope, we're just going to leave the dog alone in that moment, right? Mm-hmm. So do you think they have the ability to contextually understand that, or do you think that situations like that create more confusion?
No, so that's, in that sense, I'm thinking if I would use contextual consent, I guess the one thing is really just the definition of consent, but it's a contextual consent. Yeah, totally. I mean, that's almost common sense in that sense. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now we're getting all kinds of words. If the dog approaches or stays away or avoids the situation, right? The dog's brain, again, this short-term prediction of, is it good for me or not? Mm-hmm. And if it's something novel, we talked about this in the context of being anxious in new environments before. Yep. If something is novel and the amygdala, threat detector says, I'm not so sure, I'm staying away, then I don't think it's necessarily not giving consent, It's just saying, I don't want that kind of interaction.
Sure.
I don't want to approach that kind of situation.
Yes.
And then obviously you don't force it, right? Versus it's not being considered a threat, and I'm exploring, I'm open to socially interact. And then, yeah, you could say contextual consent as in saying yes to that kind of interaction.
Yeah, that makes sense. So would you say your issue with consent, quote unquote, is more with the human definition of it being put on dogs? Like if there was a different word for it, would you say would you have less of a problem with it? Or is it more to the concept that if we're always looking for the quote unquote consent from dogs, you're not preparing them for the inevitables in real world?
I think it's more like what the impacts are on humanizing our dogs even more so, right? So yeah, for one, definitely you can't always rely on the dog giving consent. You cannot forget to make your dog work through stress at some point. But also the other, I think one of the comments was, wait, so you're never asking your dog for consent before petting your dog. And that's like, hey, it's a bridge too far, because I don't go to my dog and ask for consent. Like, how does this even look like? Am I just holding out my hand? Am I actually asking, do you want to be pet by me? No, it's the foundational nonverbal understanding of our relationship. Whether or not, and yes, I sometimes go up to my dog because I want to pet my dog, but I also know that the way I pet my dog, the timing, all that is not going to hurt him, right? So I'm never just, and sometimes my dog comes up and I don't want, the cuddles right now because I'm busy, right? But it's not that my dog is asking me for consent on something like this, right? So it's this, you're putting some kind of frameworks onto something that is, again, take it just in the most simple explanation, have such a good nonverbal understanding of who your dog is and the likes and dislikes that you don't have to put frameworks and protocols on top of it in order to not make a mistake. And that's kind of driving us away from, again, what it means to be a dog and a human in the same household, and more into, almost becomes political in that sense.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny, like what you just said at the end there. It's like, yeah, because if you look at that, it's like, why are we overcomplicating it so much? Like, I know my dog and I know what my dog likes and doesn't like. So it's like, I don't even think about it. It's just like my Malinois, like he doesn't like to be picked up. Not that like I would tell people you should be picking up your dogs all the time or anything, but there's times with my other dogs that we're hanging out and it's like, let me just scoop you up real quick, right? And I know he really, really does not like that, right? And if I needed to do it to get him up into something or whatever it may be, like I know I can do it, but I generally avoid doing it because I know he doesn't like it, right? And I don't have to think so much about it, and I don't look at it as like such a hindrance or anything like that. It's just like, you know who your dog is. You're getting back to what we talked about earlier, which is we know their baseline of their likes and their dislikes, and we can make sure that we kind of exist and create our, craft our relationship around some of that kind of stuff in a way where it's mutually beneficial for both of us, So I like that.
It's the combination of, we respect each other. And maybe that gets lost also with all this. You have to ask for consent. You have to put this protocol and you have to do this and this in order for you to know your dog. Like, take this all away. Just hang out with your dog, look at your dog, observe your dog, and you get a feel for it, right? But also have good times together, so that when there are bad times and you have to pick up your dog, like my Mel's, like, this is probably for her the biggest betrayal ever if I was to pick her up. It's like, how dare you? Like,
it's the same.
Right? But when I have to weigh her, like at home, I have to pick her up, right? But then she knows. It's like, okay, this is happening. I don't like it, but right now it's happening. It happens once every 3 months. So it's not something that she has to suffer through. But we have that kind of understanding that if something has to happen, it has to happen. And no one is going to die. And we're all going to walk away with a healthy relationship regardless, right? And that part, goes back to the basics. And I think we're kind of losing that touch. Really, that touch a little bit.
I like that. Okay, last one. What would you say, as somebody who knows more deeply about a lot of this stuff than your average person, or in many cases a lot of trainers, obviously, what would you say are a couple of the biggest things you see either owners do or trainers do that frustrate you because of the knowledge that you have? that you feel like are just like either incorrect or counterproductive or whatever it may be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we actually touched on all of the things already. I think the biggest thing really is coming down to becoming comfortable with your dog's arousal level, seeing this as like something that makes your dog a learning monster. So you can teach even the calmer behaviors through the arousal, even though that sounds like contradicting each other, but it's actually not.
Yeah.
So that part, and, also in that context, when you get a puppy, and your first thing is you take it to puppy class and want to teach all the obedience, right? The sit, the down, the stay, before you even know who your puppy is. I think is a lot of missed opportunities to set the right tone, if you will, or to create a routine of this is how we play together or interact, and a routine of now you're also just by yourself. Obviously in the crate or whatever, supervised, well, not supervised, but by yourself. Setting this all in place first before you go into now we work together and train for something is kind of like skipping really important steps to make you someone your dog really wants to work with, and to make you someone that your dog can live with, wants to live with, but also can be without for a little bit of time. Because we have either this overdependence on input, right? Or we have we're not doing anything ever together unless we go to this class once a week.
Yeah.
So kind of that part, that initial, let's get to know each other, is missing a lot of time. And having a little more confidence, you can do it. It's really hard, especially with a puppy, but you don't necessarily need to start out with a puppy class at 8 weeks.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I've ever seen anybody who's done a puppy class from the standpoint of those like 8-week-old programs that's really gained the long-term skills that they need with the dog. And that's not even an obedience thing. It's just, you mentioned routine. It's like, I feel like a lot of issues I see with dogs are because owners don't have clear routines of how they do some of the things with them. Whatever way you're going to do them, just like having some predictability in the dog's life, right? Or having some routine as far as them knowing what to expect in different situations and stuff like that. I feel like it goes such a long way. And a lot of the frustration and confusion I see come out of dogs is because they don't know what's expected of them at any time because the routine is constantly changing, Yeah. And with puppies, like, man, like people don't realize like how, like, yes, puppies can be a little bit of a pain in the ass sometimes. Like, don't get me wrong with like the potty training and the crate training and like all that kind of stuff. Like some of it can be a real freaking headache, right? But like past those two things, I will say everything else can be pretty damn easy. If you really almost like do less, right? And just like I said, observe who your dog is, have predictable routines for stuff, and not try to just like cram and force everything right off the rip,
Yeah, for sure. It's being like, you keep forgetting how time consuming and frustrating it can be to have a puppy, because every time you see a puppy, it's like, I want another puppy. But it's like really tough to raise a puppy. But we often assume having a puppy is the best part of getting a dog. But no, it's like, I want to skip to the part where I can actually have this focused dog that I can work with. Because at the initial phase, it's really, really difficult.
Yeah.
And I had a puppy recently. It's a hunting kind of dog, 3 months old, and based on the breed and all, like really active. Like the owner is really struggling with the arousal level, and being okay with saying, okay, I get up in the morning, but I don't have to be with this dog for 4 hours. I get up in the morning, potty break, a little bit of play, feeding, potty break again, and then you go back into your crate for 2 hours. Like, don't feel guilty for that and have your own morning routine. And I took this puppy to the vet, and it was obviously an environment the dog hasn't been in, people the dog hasn't seen. It was like really the entire time active. And this is maybe another one of these things. Like the vet suggested to see a vet behaviorist and potentially discuss medication. That makes me really, really sad. Because that's.
And this was what, a 10-week-old puppy, something like that?
12 weeks. 12 weeks.
2
months.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
And it's like, fortunately, they're like, because we work together, they know that this is definitely not the way to go.
Yeah.
But it seems to be like so abnormal if you have an aroused puppy or an aroused dog or an excited dog or a dog with a lot of energy. It's like that can't be normal.
Yeah.
Got to do something about it. And then instead of thinking about like really good, how do I train this and dive into it, the first option is medication oftentimes.
Yeah.
And there will be a lot of people who say, no, that's not true. Medication has changed my life. Yes, that's certainly can help. But again, it just suppresses it. The true needs of this dog. And do we really want this with all the things that we're doing for our dogs? All these have to be the best humans and pure positive only treats, but then we give them medication to suppress the anxiety level that we kind of induce in other maybe subconscious ways.
Yeah.
I don't know, we got to question these things a little bit more and be a little bit more critical with our own decision making.
Yeah, the medication thing is like a whole freaking, we could go off 4 hours talking about that, obviously, because I have a lot of opinions on that. It's interesting, like a lot of the people that I've heard preach that medication has helped my dog so much also, like, I don't want to say it didn't help them, but at the same time, I do think there's a big like placebo effect at play sometimes too, of like, I'm paying $300 a month on freaking dog medication, so I have to convince myself that it's doing something, when in actuality, like, we'll meet the dog and it's like, your dog's still pretty freaking out of control, right? They still have a lot of the behaviors that you originally put the dog on the medication for in the first place, you know? Yeah. So it's tough. And then the recommending with a puppy, like going to see a behaviorist, which we know is probably going to prescribe some sort of medication. It's like, there's also plenty of dogs that just don't really like the vet, but are fine everywhere else. You know, like I see that all the time where owners will call me and they are like crying. It's like, they've been doing so well with their training everywhere, but they had a bad vet visit. And then the vet like basically convinces them that everything is terrible and they need to go to a behaviorist and this and that. And it's like, but how's the rest of your day-to-day going? They're like, it's great. I was like, how many times a year do you go to the vet? They're like, maybe once. I'm like, okay. So it's like, maybe don't worry too much about it. It's like, there's things we could do to improve on that, obviously, but like, that's such a small part of dogs' lives. And in a lot of cases, when the vets are recommending these medications, they're going off of only their observations in this like high stress, high pressure environment, which is the vet office, you know?
Yeah.
So it's tough.
Yeah. It's obviously, like you said, a very complicated topic. And I don't want to say, obviously, not all vets are like this, and people come to them, even behaviorists, for help, and they help the way they can, which is they're not there to see you once a week at your home and go through tedious training with you.
Sure.
They're there to give you immediate relief in one way or another. Yeah. And in a way, you also pay a lot of money just to see a behaviorist. You're not going to walk out there saying, I don't know, go on longer walks, you know? So you kind of everyone is in a kind of situation, which kind of just comes down to, we kind of need to all start to just look deeper into what this all means, rather than having quick fixes and enjoying the ride. Even if there are lots of downs, enjoy the ride. Yeah.
I saw your post about progress, like not always being this and not always being this, but sometimes it's, you know?
Right.
Which is very much true for sure. Yeah. So you got anything else you want to add, Josh?
No, I'm just, this one I had to just zone in and take it all in.
Josh is our we tell all the guests, he's our non-dog training layman's terms guy. So he asks like the regular day-to-day owner questions, and you know. Yeah,
but that one was I had to soak that one in. So
yeah. Well, listen, this was fantastic. I have literally, like I said, I binge watched your content over the last like couple of days here, and I have probably like 800 questions that I think maybe I asked like one of them. So I would definitely love to do this again at some time and get more into some of that other kind of stuff. But I really appreciate you coming on, and like I said, I really like the work that you're doing. So happy to have you.
Thank you.
So anything you want to add?
No, I think it was good stuff. Say again?
Oh, I was going to say, tell people where to find you, all that.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, everything. I post a lot of things online. Obviously, the world is happening online. So Canine Decoded, it is. And my website is caninedecoded.com, Canine Decoded on Instagram, Canine Decoded, I think even on TikTok, although I don't really do much on TikTok. And everyone who's listening, come and say hi. Hell
yeah. Well, until next time, we appreciate you being on, and I'll I'll send you everything once it comes out, and you feel free to use whatever you want.
Sounds good. Love it.
We'll see ya.
Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye.